against those who happen to be well off. What do you make of that argument?
Well, it's not envy, it's war. It is a class war, and it's a war that has been perpetrated by the rich on to everybody else. I mean, the class war is one they started. The mistake they've made, to deal with the racial part of this, is their boot has been on the necks of people of color since we began. This is a nation founded on genocide and built on the backs of slaves. All right. So we started with a racial problem. We tried to actually eliminate one entire race, and then we used another race to build this country, actually quite quickly as a new country, into a world power. This country never would have had the wealth that it had it not had slavery for a couple of hundred years. If it had had to pay people, they actually had to pay people to build America. You know, we might just be at that point in Utah where we're joining the two rails together, maybe at this point right now.
New York, New York. It is arguably still the preeminent global financial center. As far as money and media go, it's the city that's the world headquarters for both. And so perhaps the title Center of the World is fitting. But here's an unpleasant reality less talked about. While New York, both the city and the state, were centers of the abolitionist struggle to finally end slavery, it was actually enslaved Africans that built the infrastructure of the colonial city. And it was that way from the 1600s to 1827, when slavery was legally abolished in New York City. We rarely think of New York as a slave-holding city, but it had more slaves than any other city except Charleston, South Carolina. It's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and for some shameful. Perhaps that's why many shy away from talking about it.
And what happens is the burial ground is listed on old New York City maps, but in the 1790s, as the city grew, the burial ground itself was just paved over. And then in the 1990s, the federal government decided to build this new office building here. And when they excavated this site for the foundation, they found hundreds and maybe thousands of bodies that had been buried prior to 1790. And all of a sudden, there was a tremendous investigation because what they discovered from the maps is this is the African burial ground. What happens is as New York City grew, people are familiar that Wall Street had a wall. The Wall Street wall was in 1664 when it was a Dutch city, New Amsterdam. When, at the time of the American Revolution, it's a British city, and the wall is actually on Chambers Street, just on the other side of this building. Africans, even though they were Christian, were considered to be heathen, and they were not allowed to be buried on the church grounds within the city limits. So they are buried outside the wall in this area just outside New York City. Now, part of the reason that this area was used is also very swampy. Just below, we'll see, is an area they called the Collect, and behind that is an area called 5 Points. It's very swampy areas. As a result, they were not prime for people to live. This was used as the African burial ground. The whole area was just paved over. It was lost to history. It was erased from the past, and was only found when they started digging the foundation for this office building.
Navigating our way through the busy streets of downtown, we arrive at New York's famous City Hall. Although slavery ends in New York State legally in 1827, city merchants and bankers continued to be tied to slave trade and slave-produced commodities. For example, William Havemeyer, mayor of New York City, launched his political career from the family's sugar refining business. The sugar was produced in the South and Cuba by enslaved African labor.
Havemeyer owns a sugar company which offices are just across the East River in Brooklyn. At the time it's known as Havemeyer Sugar, now it's known as Domino Sugar. Domino Sugar, owned by the mayor of the city of New York, is producing sugar in the Caribbean, and it's being processed in Brooklyn and distributed around the world.
Another New York mayor, Fernando Wood, who later becomes a congressman, opposed and campaigned heavily against the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which abolished slavery.
In 1861, as the nation is moving to civil war, the South is starting to secede, the mayor of the city of New York actually gives a speech to the New York City Council, and he proposes that New York City secede along with the South. And he makes this proposal because he says they owe us so much money and we are so commercially tied together. If they leave and we stay, how will they repay us back?
But it wasn't just the sugar trade, it was also cotton. Singer writes in his book, the founders of Brown Brothers Harriman built their bank by lending millions of dollars to Southern planters and arranging for the shipment and sale of slave-grown cotton. When the bank took control of 3 Louisiana plantations at one point, it also got 346 enslaved Africans. John Jacob Astor, America's first multimillionaire, made his fortune in part through cotton transportation. He was also part of the slave trade. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel and neighborhoods in New York City are named after him. Lehman Brothers, a merchandising business that quickly evolved into a cotton brokerage firm, is another example. And finally, Charles L. Tiffany, who got the financing to open a fancy goods store from his father, who operated a cotton mill in Connecticut using cotton picked by Southern slave labor. Tiffany & Co., the internationally renowned jeweler, was born. The list goes on. Today, the South Street Seaport is one of New York's many waterfront tourist attractions, with restaurants and gift shops. Singer explains that although in 1807 it was illegal to bring enslaved Africans into the United States, a restaurant named Sweets continued to be the meeting place of the global slave trade in secret, and just up the street was the bank that financed the slave trade, Citibank.
Complex here dates from 1810. It's one of the oldest building complexes in the city of New York. Well, what happens, and then the waterfront is right here. What happens in the 1850s, there's a restaurant in this building right in front of us called Sweets. And Sweets is the meeting place of the global slave trade. Boats are outfitted in the harbor of New York, and what happens is it's illegal to bring enslaved Africans into the United States after 1807. In fact, the slave trade itself has been declared illegal by Great Britain and the United States. It's a capital offense after 1820 for an American to be involved in the slave trade. But we have documentation of what's happening because in 1854, one of the slave traders is arrested. He's turned in by his crew. He cheats them on pay. He's furious that he's being put on trial for slave trading. So he testifies, and his testimony is on the front page of the New York Times. And then later he writes it up into a book. And what he says is that at Sweets, at South Street Seaport, at this restaurant, the slave traders meet to plan their voyages. And a couple blocks up this way, south of us on South Street, is the bank that finances the slave trade. And what they're doing is they call the Africans black ivory, and what they do is they outfit the boats here, they then sail to Africa. In Africa, they load enslaved Africans and they bring them back to Cuba. Amistad is not an isolated case, but Amistad is part of this transatlantic shipment of human beings.
Back in June, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio dedicated this plaque steps away from what was once the Wall Street slave market.
Same place, on the F train. Took the express train, skip that local shit, my vocal sick, that's how success came. Once kings, now we pawns in this chess game. Wall Street got black slave blood stains, which means we built this city and never got scrapped while the devil got trapped. In fact, reparations for niggas in desperation. Fuck money, give my kid a real education.
The plaque honors those who passed through the slave market, located near Pearl and Water Streets. During a memorial, the mayor said it was true 3 centuries ago, even though it was never acknowledged. It was true then, it is true today. It will be true tomorrow.